and just learn all about foreign policy issues. Here at the Wilson Center, I coordinate the China Environment Forum that's been putting on meetings, creating publications, and doing exchanges since 1997. Today's talk is by James Kynge, who wrote this. I can't think of enough wonderful adjectives for how great this book is. It's called China Shakes the World, and as my testimony to him this morning, I told him that I have a 22-month-old toddler, so working full time and then taking home of a child, I still had energy at night to want to read his book because it is so good. Now a lot of people know that he's been a journalist in Asia for 2 decades, and was the China bureau chief for Financial Times until 2005. But something that's not in his bio that I read somewhere else is that actually started studying Chinese in 1982. And I was there 5 years later doing the English teacher routine, but I was quite amused to learn, back in 82 was a hard time to try to study Chinese because people wouldn't want to talk to you, I think, was what I've heard you relate in other talks. But he did manage to master Mandarin Chinese, so besides working as a journalist and covering some of the major events in the region, from Tiananmen Square to the Taiwan missile crisis, he also is fluent in Chinese, and I'm sure your Chinese friends always say 中国通, correct? I'm going to stop talking because you came here to hear him. He's going to be talking about his new book for about 20 minutes or so, and then he'll be opening up for Q&A. And we will, outside by the time you leave, there should be books for sale, and if you're nice, he'll probably sign one for you. Okay, and can we welcome James Kynge?
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that very kind introduction, and especially the line about reading it with the 22-month-old child. That's really beyond the call of duty, I think. It's wonderful to be here in Washington, D.C. This is my first time. And I was absolutely amazed by the beauty of the place. I know it's a cliche, but it really does look like it looks in the movies. And it's fabulous to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. What a fantastic place this is. As Jennifer's mentioned, I have done this book about China. It's called China Shakes the World. And it's about really as many of the influences that I could find of China influencing the world, the economic rise of China, and the impact that's having. But before I came here, I was asked to focus more on the environmental impact of China's rise. So that's really what my prepared speech will be about today. But if there are other questions or other topics that people would like to discuss when I finish this, then we can just talk about anything that you'd like to discuss. I'd like to thank everyone here for coming to listen to a talk on China from a guy who comes from a small village in North Yorkshire. My journey from that village to China, as Jennifer's just mentioned, began in 1982 when I was one of a bunch of students from Edinburgh University to go and study in Shandong University in Jinan. And I remember shortly after we got there, the administrator of the foreign students' dormitory took us all on a trip to the Yellow River. We were rather excited by what the visit promised. One of the few things that we all knew about China then was that the Yellow River was called China's sorrow for the grief that its floods had inflicted on the Chinese people through the millennia. The records of those floods were so old, they marked the dawn of Chinese history itself. One deluge in 2297 BC had caused a horrific loss of life. And in the time since 602 BC, when meticulous records began to be kept, the river had burst its banks 1,500 times and changed its course more than 26 times. In 1887, it burst its banks at a point in Henan province, inundating 11 cities and killing perhaps as many as 2 million people. In 1938, when Chiang Kai-shek broke the banks on purpose to stall a Japanese military advance, some 900,000 people are thought to have died, and another 12 million were made homeless. So as we approached the river, the university administrator in charge of our group began to talk animatedly about the power and the majesty of the river in history and the new bridge that had just been built over it. We got to the bridge full of excitement, jumped off the bus and ran to the sides to get a good look at the mother of Chinese civilization. But we were disappointed at the muddy flow below us. It hardly looked capable of supporting a boat, let alone flooding the area around it. Perhaps the administrator noticed some of our scoffing reaction because he walked over and he said to us in serious tones, "Do not look down on the Yellow River, because if you do, you are looking down on the Chinese people themselves." I didn't know it at the time, but that's a quotation from Chairman Mao. And with hindsight, it's clear now that the Yellow River had back then already begun the decline that has characterized it in recent years. Now, far from inflicting sorrow on the surrounding population, it elicits pathos for an entirely different reason, because it is drying up. In some recent years, its flow has stopped before the river reaches the sea, and in 1997, its bed was dry in the lower reaches for 226 days of the year. Back in 1982, when I was a student, the early stages of the Yellow River's malaise were hardly an issue of importance for the outside world. The disconnect between the world then and China was profound. I remember that the year I spent in Jinan being almost completely sequestered from the outside world and from the expression of Western material culture that characterized it. You couldn't buy a coffee in the whole of Jinan, and you couldn't buy any foreign cigarettes. I spent the whole year smoking something called Big Chicken. Maybe that explains a thing or two. You couldn't make an international telephone call. I had to go to Beijing 17 hours away on the train at Christmas in order to call my parents. And there was no long-term foreign residents of Jinan in those days, apart from one man called Jim Veneris. And he'd been a GI in the Korean War and taken prisoner by the Koreans and the Chinese. And at the end of the war, for some reason, he'd elected to stay on in China rather than to go back to the States. And Jim had had a very interesting life in Jinan. About the first 10 or so years, he was working in a factory. And then when the Cultural Revolution broke out, he was moved to pull those carts through the streets. Then later on, he was put back in the factory. And in 1978, when I'm sure you all know was the year in which China announced its openness and reform program, Jim was taken from the factory to become professor of English at Shandong University. But I have to say, he had been speaking almost nothing but heavily Shandong-accented Chinese for about more than 30 years, and his English was somewhat ropey. We were round at his place one night, and I'm sitting next to him. He's giving dinner for us Edinburgh crowd, and suddenly I feel his hand gripping me on the knee, and he's whispering something urgently under his breath, and he's pointing at something on the table going, "What's that?" I said, "What, fish?" And he goes, "Oh no, every now and again I lose a word." So that was Jinan in those days, a place very disconnected from the world around it. And it was possible at that time to feel really rather detached from China's problems. And that was a situation that was reinforced by the government's policy of rejecting so-called foreign interference in China's internal affairs. However, now it is not possible to remain mere onlookers at China's environmental distress. The country has become so important to the global economy, so insinuated into the institutions of international commerce, and so large a presence on the world stage that nonchalance is not an option. The point I try and make in my book, China Shakes the World, is that the various expressions of China's ecological frailties, plus the pressure of a huge population on scarce natural resources, have become the animating energies behind several global trends. And in the short time since I wrote the book, those trends have only intensified and become more worrying to environmentalists. Probably the most important of these is the shortage of water. This problem has been widely reported, including by Jennifer in many of her works, also by Elizabeth Economy in The River Runs Black. But I still sometimes feel that the gravity of this issue may not be fully comprehended either within China or beyond its borders. According to Andy Rothman, who's an analyst at CLSA, the brokerage house, only 1/4 of the world's per capita water supply, and in the north of the country, significantly less. China only has 1/4 of the world's per capita water supply. And in some areas, it has a supply of water which is less than Israel or Yemen. And Tianjin, which I'm sure you all know is a port close to Beijing, has a per capita water supply less than that of Saudi Arabia. In addition, more than half of China's rivers are too polluted to be a source of drinking water, and 1/4 are so poisonous they can't even be used for industry. Around 136 cities in the north face severe water shortages. The irresponsible and often unregulated pumping of groundwater has meant that areas around where I live on the outskirts of Beijing, groundwater levels are falling by 2 to 3 meters a year. Already, in several overseas expressions of this water problem are evident. The most obvious comes in China's growing need for foreign agricultural produce as its ability to feed itself declines. Of its cultivated land, around 65% is north of the Yangtze, and most of the wheat, maize, soybeans, and cotton are grown in the north, which only has 20% of the country's water resources. The impact of this can already be seen in China's voracious demand for imported soybeans. And an effect of that is that the Amazon rainforest is being cleared by an area roughly the size of Belgium each year, partly to supply soybeans to China. Similar effects could be felt with other crops such as wheat, barley, and maize in the future, but probably not rice, which is regarded as particularly crucial to China's food security. Another use for water is as a source for power generation, and this is also a key external expression in the area of the Mekong, upon which tens of millions of people depend for their livelihoods in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. But upstream in China, where the river is called the Lantang, the demands for rapid urbanization and industrialization has fostered a dam building spree. 2 dams have already been built in Yunnan province, 2 more are under construction, and a further 4 have been designed. Nor are these dams small. One of them, called the Xiaowan, is to be second only in size to the Three Gorges Dam that spans the Yangtze River. The effects of these dams on the downstream riparian states has been predictable. The flow of water downstream has been greatly reduced. From January to March 2004, the Mekong reached a record low in its flows. One marine policeman in Thailand said that in that year he could walk across the river from Thailand to Laos. In addition, fish have had difficulty spawning when the waters are low, a factor that has seriously reduced fish catches in Cambodia, where millions depend on river fish for their livelihoods. So far, this issue has been a low-intensity political issue between China and the other riparian states. But Beijing has declined to participate in clear water usage agreements and quotas with its neighbors, so the possibility of future tension is significant. A third external expression of China's environmental malaise is in the area of air pollution. Not only has the air quality in Hong Kong and South Korea, I'm sure many of you have visited those places, been severely affected, but also the US Environmental Protection Agency has said that on some days, 25% of the particulate matter in the skies above Los Angeles come from China. This is something that the Chinese dispute, but without having conducted their own study. Some US experts claim that 1/3 of all Californian airborne pollution comes from China. Certainly, China's coal burning, the main source of sulfur dioxide, the key cause of acid rain, is enormous. as the country has added enough electricity capacity to power a whole country the size of Spain every year in recent years. The consumption of coal has risen to 2 billion tons a year. That's up 800 million tons since the end of, in the 5 years to the end of 2005. That is, for example, about 6 times the amount of coal burned by a country like Australia. And because coal is so much cheaper than other fuels, this heavy reliance will not change in the foreseeable future. In addition, China is said to spew about 600 tons of mercury into the atmosphere every year. And around that's about 1/4 of the entire world's non-natural emissions. The effect of a rising China on the world's forests is even more palpable. In 1998, the response to flooding down the Yangtze River, China placed several restrictions on logging. At the same time, it became the world's largest furniture maker and paper manufacturer. The result has been ruinous for the world's forests. Much of the logging to feed China's appetite is illegal and falls outside quotas set down by exporting countries. Russia is the biggest supplier these days, mainly with spruce, fir, Scots pine and oak from non-renewable Siberian boreal forests. In many cases, these trees took 400 to 500 years to grow in frigid tundra temperatures. In Indonesia, too, an area the size of Switzerland is illegally logged each year to supply hardwoods to feed China's home-building boom. In a similar vein, Chinese demand for fish is putting strain on world's fish stocks, and yet, as with everything, per capita consumption is still low in China, at around 21 kilograms per person per year, compared to 56 kilograms per person per year in Hong Kong. The problem is that for each extra kilogram per person increase in China, some 100 million tons of fish have to be caught in the world's fisheries and oceans. Herein lies one of the key restraining factors behind China's development. Chinese people are only really wanting some of the same action that Americans and Europeans take for granted. They want a piece of the American dream. But simple mathematics suggests that it will not be possible if Chinese were to consume oil, for example, at the same rate as Americans. We would need 3 times the current annual global production. The same is true of several other finite resources. In the words of Liang Congjie, who is the head of Friends of Nature, it's an NGO in Beijing, we are going to need 4 planets to accommodate the appetites of a resurgent China. Until such time as those planets become available, the world will have to find an alternative solution. But so far, there seems to be scant recognition of the problem, let alone any solutions. From the perspective of the West, our governments remain resistant to any acceptance that China's environmental problems are partly of our making. After all, China is the manufacturing workshop in which most of the things that we buy are made. In the words of a senior environmental official in Beijing, China is not only the world's workshop, it's also the world's rubbish tip. But the efforts of China's trade partners to help resolve the problem are hardly in evidence at the moment. China's own efforts are even more so, or even less so, in evidence. The problem here, like so many of the persistent issues that China is prey to, stems from imperfections within the political system, particularly the apparent inability of the central government to bring disobedient local authorities into line. Without the checks and balances exercised at a local level, as might happen in a democratic society, local governments, which often own and control polluting local enterprises, are less often restrained from breaking their own laws and regulations. Such abuses appear to be intensifying, not abating. At times, it seems that the old phrase that Deng Xiaoping used to roll back the economic ideology of communism, that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, has been reworked by the local governments who seem to spend a lot of their time these days dodging Beijing. The new mantra would seem to be, it doesn't matter if if the mice are black or white, as long as they avoid the cat. The problem is, though, that it will eventually matter, for the Chinese a great deal, and for the rest of us too. Thank you very much.
If I could take the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question, like you guys could stop me. One thing I really appreciate you that, because I did ask him to focus a little more, pulling out from his book things that he talked about with the environment. But before we open up, I'd like to ask you one question that, another major theme of your book was talking about how China's rise is affecting the U.S. And I know that's kind of like that's a huge issue in your book. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really more of the core of the book. But what I really liked was that he did interweave so much of the environment into the book, and I'm really happy that that wasn't neglected, which I often do see in books that talk about China's economy. So,
thank you. Yes, I mean, a lot of the book is about how China is affecting the US and what we can expect for the future. I'll try and be pretty brief, but clearly one of the main topics before we even talk about outsourcing is a global phenomenon, and that is that the supply of factory labor obviously has increased dramatically over the last 10 years. Supposedly in China now there are 120 million migrant workers that have gone from the farms to the factories. Now, not all of those people have gone to factories, but from anyone's reckoning, it's a very large number of people who have joined, as it were, the global workforce. Those people are the price setters now for labor everywhere, and they are responsible, more than outsourcing, for the fact that the returns to labor all over the world have been either stagnant or falling. At the same time, the outsourcing trend that we can see across America has created a polarization between those people at the middle and at the lower income stratas who have found that their wages are not going anywhere or even decreasing, and the people at the higher, in the higher wealth bracket. Those tend to be the people who run the companies, and they, of course, have their bonuses and their salaries linked to the profitability of the company. So that after the outsourcing has taken place and moved over to China, profitability increases, costs go down, their bonuses go up, their salaries go up. And this effect, therefore, is partly responsible, I would say, to a significant degree, for what I regard as the most interesting phenomenon in the global economy today, and that is that the rich are getting richer and the middle are going nowhere. Now, why do I think that's important? Because I think it's potentially a political issue. In the States, I think it's fair to say, although I'm hesitant standing where I am now in the middle of Washington, D.C., to say that the Fortune 500 significantly influences who gets into Congress. But I would say that when push comes to shove, it's the middle demographic, the most numerous demographic, who actually vote those guys in. And if those people start to feel like they're being cheated by globalization and they're being cheated by the rise of China, then we could see an upsurge in protectionist pressure, which could create all sorts of problems for the cause of free trade between China and the West. I'm not just talking about the States. This is a highly prevalent problem in Europe, where you have unemployment in Germany, Italy, and France at about 10%. So I think this is a really key question, and it's a question that speaks to the main question of my book. My book is not a polemic. I sort of decided that China is too contradictory, is too complex, too colorful to subject to a single linear argument. So in my book, I don't really have a very heavy argument, but I do have a big question, and that is, can the world absorb China's rise? And I think the issue that I've just mentioned is part of that. There are, of course, many other strategic issues, many other ways in which China is affecting the States, but I'll leave it for that for the first question.
Okay, so raise your hand, I'll indicate you, and just say your name and affiliation so he knows where you're coming from. Ma'am?
Hi, I'm Winter Casey from the National Journal's Technology Daily, so I'm a journalist. I was wondering if you could relate some of what you're saying in terms of technology in China, the internet, and telecom, or any of those subjects.
How do you mean related? Related to?
Like the Chinese economy, some of these agriculture problems, how it's going to affect China's economy or China's growth in technology, or just touch on any technology subjects you might have mentioned in your book. I haven't read your book.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think the first thing to say about technology in China is that China's competitive challenge to the rest of the world, and I don't use the word threat, but that's become an emotive word when it's applied to China. But China's competitive challenge to the rest of the world is not specialized or localized. It pretty much is from the bottom of the technology ladder to quite near the top. Now, that's not the same as saying that China is an innovative and creative country. It's actually the number of new technologies in China attributable to R&D that's China-based is very small. But there are many other things going for China, and the main one is the magnetism of its market. So you have a lot of foreign companies who have to come into China. Sometimes the government links market access to technology transfer. That's becoming a very big issue. Certainly in the EU and American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. You have a lot of people who outsource their R&D to China because there are many very capable young engineers who work for about 1/3 of the wage of similar people in Silicon Valley or elsewhere in the States and Europe. And then you have piracy. And China gets a lot of technology through piracy and through ripping it off from other countries. So what you have in China at the moment is a country that is competing quicker, more and more elevated positions up the technology ladder, and the rate of ascent is extremely fast. So that, for the first time you have a huge emerging economy that is not only competing in the labor-intensive area, it's competing in capital-intensive, technology-intensive, and really right from the top to the bottom. I think that's the first thing I'd say about it. The Internet, China at the moment, we've just had a talk, I just mentioned about the Yellow River. I think it's interesting to think about China as a sort of ancient hydraulic economy. And the rulers of China have had thousands of years of practice in controlling floods that potentially wreaked havoc upon their population. So when it came to the flow of information through the Internet, I think a lot of people underestimated their abilities. We all said, and I include myself in this, that there was no way that China was going to be able to regulate the flow of information through the Internet. But I'm afraid they've done it pretty effectively. And what they've managed to do, I feel, at this stage is they managed to gain a lot of the economic efficiencies of the Internet without allowing in a lot of the types of comment and criticism and political sort of dissident thinking that they want to keep out. I'd say that, first of all, about the Internet. But I think Internet's moving so quickly, and now what we're seeing is different technologies applied to the Internet, such as self-generated content. And there are several websites in China that are swapping all kinds of self-generated video, songs, poetry, novels. There's plenty of online publishing companies in China on the Internet. So I'd say this is kind of like round one. The first set in the tennis match has gone to China, but I think they're going to have much bigger problems as time goes on in controlling the Internet.
Since I might be the only one that read the book, can I ask a question related to the technology? Could you talk briefly about the case in Italy with the textile plants? Because we're always thinking about jobs going to China, but this was kind of a different twist with the Chinese workers going to Italy.
Right. Thank you. It's basically I go to a place called Prato, which has been the center of the Italian textile industry for about 700 years. Machiavelli was said never to have missed a market day in Prato, and he was a sharp dresser. The thing about Prato is when you get there, you notice that a huge proportion of the population are Chinese. And later on, I found out that out of a population of 180,000 people, 40,000 are Chinese. Most of them are, former illegal immigrants who've come across the Soviet Union, walked through Eastern Europe, sometimes through the former Yugoslavian war zone, and then got into Italy through the Adriatic. What happened was they started to arrive in the mid-'80s, and at that time they were doing the menial jobs, sweeping the floors and stacking the garments in the factories owned by the Italian bosses. And Prato is not a low-tech textile center. I mean, we're talking all of the best brands in the world source their best material from Prato. It's that kind of a place. So after about 10 years, using their informal networks of finance, these Wenzhou workers were able to raise money to go into business in competition with the Italian bosses that used to employ them. And after a further 5 years, they began to put these Italian guys out of business. And now, this place, 700 years of textile culture, is migrating from Prato back to Wenzhou. And the reason that I went there was to test a common assumption, or a common argument anyway, that you hear in Europe, which is that Europe can compete with China as long as we reform our welfare system, unemployment, healthcare, all of those things, plus the bureaucracy that adds a great deal of cost to doing business. If only we can reform all of that, then we can take on the Chinese. But I'm afraid Prato offers a different interpretation. And that is because the Chinese workers, the newly arrived illegal immigrants from China, are working double the hours with no welfare payment at all, for half the pay of their Italian counterparts there. And even with that very, very low rate of remuneration, they're 10 times more expensive than the workers back in Wenzhou. And that is why the industry is migrating from Prato back to Wenzhou. So I would say that you can say, okay, well, that's an example of a labor-intensive industry. Actually, textiles, as they are in Prato, is hardly a labor-intensive industry. It's a very high-tech industry. Yeah.
Okay, sir, gentlemen. Oh, could you get the mic for us? Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Ken Hansen. I'm with China Springboard. We help technology companies enter the China market. First, let me thank you for this. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. Some fascinating stuff this morning. Unfortunately, you laid out some significant problems with the environment. Unfortunately, perhaps the world is motivated to solve those kind of problems by economics, right? What is the opportunity for the world from a business perspective to solve this problem for China and the world itself?
Right. Well, I think that there are clear business implications for this. I would sort of stick my neck out and say that because of necessity, because of the fact that there is no way that the Chinese people can consume and behave like Americans. There just are not the resources on this planet to do that. Because of this very, very clear push factor, the Chinese government and various Chinese agencies will have to move towards the adoption of environmentally friendly technologies, perhaps quicker than almost anywhere else. But, I mean, we have experts on this question in the room, so perhaps Jennifer can comment on that more. We're beginning to see some real determination in some areas, like, hydrogen cells, wind energy. Nuclear, obviously, is one of the areas that China is moving into very significantly. But, unfortunately, I think that while China is a place where you can have many different realities at the same time. You can have, almost for every trend, you can construe a counter-trend. And I think this is one of those issues. You probably will have a huge consumer of environmental technologies and one of the most polluted countries on the planet. And perhaps it will go, I mean, if you go to Shanghai these days, they've done pretty well, actually. Shanghai's not half as polluted as Beijing. But then you move inland from Shanghai to places that are poorer, and you still find the pollution is appalling. So I think you may have, a lot of activity, but you'll have huge swaths of the country that remain the most polluted places on Earth. Yeah.
If I could interject, building on a comment that you made, that the China Environment Forum, we just had a meeting this past Monday talking about technology transfer and renewable energy and automobiles, and one of the speakers talking about the auto sector was saying that a lot of the U.S. companies and Japanese and Europeans that go to China to build their cars are not bringing the most environmentally friendly technology because they are concerned about intellectual property protections, and so there's a bit of a problem there, and the fact that autos, you live in Beijing, and I feel really sorry for you with your lungs, but that autos are responsible for anywhere from like 70 to 80% of the air pollution now in China. So it's a huge issue, and it's not an easy answer. Julie, can you pass the mic to Brent? Do you had a question?
Hi, Brent Christensen from the Department of State. There has been some reporting that suggested that China's GDP growth rate should have 2 or 3 points deducted to account for the environmental damage it is inflicting upon itself. I wonder if you could comment on that and China's very resource-intensive development model and what that implies both for China and perhaps for world markets.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think, as a broad statement, I think that there definitely should be percentage points deducted from the headline growth figure. How much is a really, really difficult question to answer. I think, I've always had a great deal of skepticism about those figures anyway, whether or not the GDP figures actually represent the real growth rate. Sometimes I think they understate, sometimes they overstate. And then you try to sort of drill down and see how much should possibly be deducted. And one example comes to mind. You may have seen this, but in 2004 there was an academic from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences who was based in Shanxi, which is the main coal-producing area of the whole country, and he had done a calculation going back 20 years on GDP minus environmental cost and the cost of the resources mined. And his finding was that GDP growth rate should have been just above zero for the entire 20-year period. In other words, the cost of the environment and the cost of the resources that have been taken out of the ground almost compensated for the entire GDP of that province. Now, that report was shot down very quickly by the authorities in Beijing, and I don't know what his methodology was, and I don't know if it was reliable, but I do feel that in some areas, and I think that the key point here is that this environmental problem is a hidden deficit. It is not on the balance sheet yet. They are not yet allowing in their computations for this terrible water crisis in northern China. Neither are they allowing for all the health costs that they're storing up for themselves in the future, and all the other problems that come from air pollution, etc. So, I think it's not a very satisfactory answer. I can't give you a 2-3% answer, but I do think that it is an enormous problem.
Okay, real quick, Nick, and then gentleman there. So, Tim, you could come up here.
Nick Lardy, Institute for International Economics. I'm wondering, James, I have the impression that in the last 5 years maybe that energy in particular has become more underpriced relative to world markets in China, and that we know water is very substantially underpriced. So my question is, more generally, as a solution to some of these problems, how much leverage could they get for more realistic pricing? Is this almost irrelevant or would take them a long way, at least in the short run? Or, where is it on the scale?
Good question. I think you could also apply that question to your area of speciality, which is the banking system. How much leverage could they get from proper commercial lending criteria and interest rates that reflect the demand and supply situation? But talking about water and energy, particularly water, clearly it would have a major effect if they could raise the price of water, and they are raising the price of water in some urban areas, but that's a very uneven process. Some cities like Beijing are having significant increase in water price, and some cities that are less well off are having much smaller increases in water price. But the problem is that when you get to the rural areas, the Chinese government seems to have made the determination that the peasant farmers or the farmers are not wealthy enough to take on the burden of higher water prices. And this is, in my opinion, true. As we all know, the average farm size for a farming family is less than 1 acre in China. So these people are earning, according to Angus Madison's work, about the same as what they did in the Tang Dynasty 1,000 years ago. So, their ability to take on increase in water prices is very much under question. And I feel that given the fact it's a single-party state, paranoid about social unrest, the government will not take that decision because of the fact that it may foment some sort of bad feeling on the farm. When it comes to energy, I think that's there's more scope for maneuver for the Chinese government in that area. But and it's something that's always puzzled me. I remember, I'm sure you remember too, in around the year 2000, it was a big question as to whether or not they would raise the price of diesel used on the farm. And they went back and forth, and they couldn't find a determination on it. To me, they could raise the price of the inputs without endangering social harmony. But possibly there's a subtext to this, is that they don't want to raise the price of these energy inputs because they don't want to undermine the competitiveness of their exporters, which, as you very well know, in manufacturing, Chinese exporters are generally on a very, very thin margin indeed. And these companies provide a lot of the employment that allows China to create 24 million new jobs every year. So the government is loath to take steps in that regard as well.
Okay, Tim, the gentleman right here in the blue, and then I'll move to the back of the room.
Thank you. Carl Dahlman, Georgetown University. Thank you, James. I look forward to reading your book. I'll take advantage to ask two questions. One is picking up on the first question you had about how the rise of China, and beyond China, you have India and other emerging economies, new labor force coming into the world, putting a big adjustment pressure on the whole global system. So I wonder if you can just extrapolate a little bit more. Where else do you see this tension? One is in the environment, the other one is in terms of exports. Where else? And immediately following to that is, to what extent are the kind of mechanisms to be able to deal with this adjustment difficulties? Obviously, one is protectionism. What other things can be put in place? And the other question comes back to part of what you began to pick up now. Part of the reason, as I understand it, for this big problem on the environment side is that the whole incentive regime in China is depending on growth and employment. And as long as that's there, environment gets the short change. And so when you have this system, and a one-party system that depends on delivering growth as the economic goods to stay in power, how could that be addressed?
Okay. That's a lot of very good questions. I hope I can remember most of them. Can I kind of craft a sort of general answer to that? I think I'll touch on most of your points. I would start with the other sources of tension between the US and China, or between the West and China. Obviously, the most obvious at the moment is this trade imbalance. I think the trade deficit, the US trade deficit with China this year is going to be in excess of 114 billion. Is that about right, Nick? And with Europe, it's another whacking great deficit. And because there are other signs of stress within the US and European economies, such as the lower returns to labor. And in the future, in my opinion, the same thing will happen with white-collar workers as more of the graduating engineers move into the workplace in China. So we have several issues there that make governments such as the US and in Europe very concerned. Now then what happens is that those governments try to redress those concerns by going to Beijing and asking the Beijing government to take steps. And as you very well know, until now, one of the main requests has been let the renminbi appreciate or revalue the renminbi. But in that case and in several other cases, what happens is that the politicians get lost in what I call the clash of systems between China and the West. And particularly, the system that I'm referring to in this case is the system whereby China, as I just mentioned, creates 24 million new jobs every year. That, by the way, is more than the equivalent of solving Europe's long-term unemployment problem every single year. So they have this very, very major constraint. And they also have a banking system that doesn't lend according to commercial criteria, which is responsible for the fact that more than 90% of manufactured products are in long-term oversupply, which is responsible for the fact that the manufacturers make very low margins, which means that the government is loath to take actions that will cause those companies to go under. And then you have things like the environmental problem and the problem of piracy. When you trace these problems right back to their roots, they all come down to the political systemic mismatch between China and the West. Just let's take piracy for a minute. It turns out that one of the main reasons for the piracy of many things in China is that local governments are either running the factories that rip off the goods and make counterfeit goods, or they're in close leagues with the pirates at local level. And the central government in Beijing is exercising more and more tenuous control over these local governments. So you really have a problem of systems there as well. So what I'm saying is that we have these big problems, then the ability to resolve them gets lost in this maze of sort of systemic mismatch. And then on top of that, you have problems of a totally different nature that also stoke bad feeling towards China. One of them is this projection of China's environmental malaise that we were just talking about. The other is the strategic issues. We won't talk about Taiwan, won't talk about Japan. Let's talk about something relatively new, and that is the fact that China's rise creates this appetite that is, as we all know, enormous, but it's also indiscriminate. China needs oil and resources so badly that it has to take them wherever it can get them. That means that they go to Sudan and they become the top foreign investor in Sudan. They go to Iran and they sign a $70 billion long-term oil import and drilling contract. And when Hugo Chavez comes to town, he gets the red carpet treatment. All of these things annoy the states because those countries are regarded as rogue or rival policies. So, you have this sort of constellation of different things, but at the center of it is this apparent inability to really get traction on resolving these issues. And I think that's what's quite concerning, to me at least.
Okay, gentleman in the back, right in the middle there. I don't know. Get him a microphone.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Wang Yao from Georgetown Law Center. Just now in your speech, you mentioned that local government controls the high polluted enterprises, and they even broke their laws to let the enterprises to pollute. So I wonder if we did not change it fundamentally, this situation, and if we try to sell the environment-friendly technologies to those enterprises, they just do not buy our beers. So I wonder, from the political and legal perspectives, do you have any ideas on how we can change this? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure that I do have any constructive ideas, I'm afraid. That's the preserve of journalists. We're allowed to criticize, but we don't have to make policy. But I would say in answer to your question that I think there is widespread recognition that this is, to the Chinese government, to those guys sitting in Zhongnanhai, I think this is, certainly within the top 5 issues. The issue of disobedience of local governments. And I would support that by saying that I'm sure you remember, the 4th plenum of the 16th Party Congress in October 2004 was, the subject of that plenum was entitled, How to Improve the Communist Party's Capacity to Rule. I thought that was the most revealing one sentence that I think I read in the entire 8 years that I was reporting for the FT in Beijing. That to me shows a very severe level of concern in the Communist Party about the localities. And, how do you wrest power back from the localities when you have a system in which is like a perfect pyramid, but every layer of that pyramid, every layer of the hierarchy and bureaucracy is the image of the next layer above it and below it, which means that if you have an official at this layer, let's say he's the mayor of a town, he has all the resources of government in his office building. He can tell them what to do. He pays them. If the Environmental Protection Agency guy says that they shouldn't be doing this, but he reckons they should, he can fire that guy. He controls that guy's wages. So it's a problem of political structure, if you ask me. And given the fact that the Chinese government has ruled out any pluralism, I'd say reform moving towards a more pluralistic political system with checks and balances exercised from outside the party, then I think they're going to have a very, very tough time in solving that problem. What they're talking about at the moment is intra-party, democracy. But if you ask me, I think that these measures of trying to impose checks and balances from within the party may have some effect. They may do some good over the next few years, but ultimately, the patient can't cure itself. You need a doctor to come and cure the patient.
Okay, down here, and then Wang Liang.
Richard Selden, private legal consultant. I wanted to ask you a question about Shanghai, which you suggested before. I read some statistics about the top 15 polluting cities in the world. Of course, 10 were in China, but I was curious. Shanghai was not one of those. What have they done? What is there about Shanghai that makes it a less polluting city? Is it the leadership, the kinds of actions that they've taken? Is it the geography? If you could talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think that part of it has been an economic effect and part of it's been a political effect. The economic effect has been that the cost of manufacturing in Shanghai is very high relative to the rest of China. So, you've got land costs, you've got rental costs, you've got labor costs. All of those costs mean that if you're manufacturing, labor-intensive stuff in Shanghai, you're probably not as competitive as you should be. So that was one reason why a lot of these industries moved from Shanghai up the Yangtze River. You can find many, many boom towns up the Yangtze River, like Wuhu, Anqing, there's several of them. And they're all really receiving this wealth and the manufacturing capacity radiating out from Shanghai. There is a political dimension to it as well. I think the Shanghai government at a fairly early stage decided that they wanted to attract high-tech industries, and they've got some really first-class high-tech industrial parks there, like Kunshan. And they supply, good tax benefits and other inducements for companies to go and locate there. I'd say that was the main reason. The other one is that, quite unlike Beijing, they have instituted a system of regulating the number of cars sold in Shanghai. So you have to bid for your number plate. And when there's a strong demand, then the price of the number plate goes up, and that regulates the amount of cars being sold. Beijing is just incredible. I do not know what is going to happen in that city in 6 months' time. I mean, it is gridlock these days, and still they're selling cars at 1,000 units a day. So I don't know why the Beijing government doesn't institute some sort of rules like that, but they don't.
Could I interject to something that I know from working with some of the Shanghai Environmental Protection Bureau peoples that I've seen over the years, that they've been given a lot of power by the Shanghai government, and they were even able to persuade the Shanghai government to change their whole energy plan, because they did a big study with the U.S. EPA on health impacts of which energy plan you take. And so, I mean, I think it's true that most local governments are the guilty parties in many ways, but I think Shanghai is a very good exception. I just wanted to add that little insight that I had from my own work. So, in the back row there.
Banning Garrett, Atlantic Council. James, you won't propose policy, so I'm going to ask you to do a little predicting or speculating, because you're pointing to crises crunch, and we, I think, see often that policy doesn't change till there's a crisis that forces people to focus their attention, shall we say. And sometimes, like Katrina, it doesn't seem to focus attention at all, and nothing changes. But nevertheless, we have a problem here forcing people to face. I mean, we have climate change coming. FT has a terrific article today about climate change and the failure to take it seriously and realize this is like the internet, it's all pervasive in its potential impact, but nobody wants to face that. So what I want to ask you from your very important presentation of these trends, what do you think might come both internally within China and as a kind of global crisis? I mean, not necessarily connected. What kinds of things could reach a climax of some kind of point, some kind of either catastrophe or enough political recognition that one was coming to actually force some serious changes, not little cosmetic ones, but put the EPA in power, as it were, or change politically maybe the structures, or simply the leadership at the top decides to take the measures to really do something about it, or internationally to do something about it.
Right.
So I know it's a tough thing to speculate on, but it would be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Seeing that you've read the FT before 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to try my best to speculate as much as possible. I think, it's tough to say, but for instance, I have read reports, and the problem with a lot of this environmental stuff and a lot of the water things in particular is you just don't know about the reliability of what you're reading. Just to give a little bit of context on that, for instance, recently I went to Dazhai, which, as you know, is the model commune of the Cultural Revolution, where the Iron Girls Production Brigade and all of those people became national icons for tilling the this sort of inhospitable Loess plateau in Shanxi and making it kind of the Garden of Eden. I went back there and I met the Iron Girl herself. And I asked her what she's doing now, and she said, well, I've given up all of that revolutionary stuff, and now I've got 3 companies. One of them, two of them make woolens, and she had a wonderful advertising slogan, which is, Dazhai woolens, warm your heart. I thought it was lovely. But it was like plastered all over the walls there, just in the Cultural Revolution way, And the other one makes liquor. And in order to make liquor, they need water. So I said to her, well, where do you get your water from? She said, well, we have a well that pumps groundwater. I said, oh, yeah, and how deep is that well now? And she said, that well now is 800 meters deep. I said, well, how deep was it in the Cultural Revolution when you were using that water to make the terraces and make the desert bloom? And she said it was 15 meters deep. So you can see, not only there, but in other places, that this water problem is very, very serious. I have read that, in many places in the northern Chinese plain, the groundwater availability, if they keep pumping at this rate, will not last beyond more 5 to 7 years. Now, the reason I have caveats is because I have no idea whether that's a correct figure. But it's very clear to me that there is a crisis waiting to happen at the bottom of the groundwater issue whenever that erupts. And I don't feel that the measures that the Chinese government is taking to alleviate this problem will actually alleviate it. The deputy head of the State Environmental Protection Agency himself told me the other day that this project to move water from the Yangtze River to the northern plains area is doomed to failure. This is a $60 billion project. And he said it's doomed to failure, A, because the water will be extremely expensive. A lot of it will have to be pumped uphill. B, because there's no way to protect the water in that channel all the way from, the Yangtze area to the north. And C, because most of the water that they're pumping is itself polluted. So I think the groundwater issue could become the source of a major crisis. And I really don't see that the government is taking any measures at the moment. I mean, where we live, you find profligate waste of water everywhere you look. People spraying their gardens all night. There's no controls on it at all. So I think that's one. Obviously, another one would be infectious disease. I mean, SARS, bird flu. We're all waiting for the next big one to come, and it's not just the journalistic community, it's the UN as well. I mean, they're writing reports saying that the big one will come. But we don't know how big it'll be. We don't know if it'll be contained, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are two environmental issues that may surface and could, I think, reach crisis proportions. I guess I tend to define a crisis as something that erupts suddenly and leaves the government sort of disorientated and unable to respond. There will be many other sort of slow-burning issues, such as health care for all of these people that are having respiratory problems because of the air pollution, etc. Yeah.
Okay. Wang Liang in the middle, and then Steve next to him.
Hi, my name is Wang Liang. I'm from Adler School, George Washington University. I have a question about our profession. You lived in Beijing and worked for FT for 8 years, and it's much longer than the time I stayed in Beijing. I was there for 5 years. When I was there, I have been very curious about the press corps in Beijing, because they seem like have a very unique information collection channel. But at the same time, you see the governmental regulation is out there, and recently we see the the events happened to the Singapore Straits Times and New York Times. And recently there's a new law passed about the foreign press in Beijing. The question is, how do you view your relationship and interaction with the government in Beijing? And related to this, a much fundamental question is, on this governmental system, how could you have your readers in the Western world informed about what is going on in China? Thank you.
I see. Thank you very much. I think, again, there's a lot of questions there. I think maybe we'll take it from the bad and move to the good. Let's take it the other way around. Let's take it from the good and move to the bad. The situation at the moment is a lot better than it was in the past. I first began as a reporter in China in '85, and then I was there through Tiananmen, and I was there in the mid-'90s as well, and then last 8 years, as you mentioned, in Beijing. So altogether, there's about 15 years of it. And I can say that in the mid-'80s, it was a very tough place to work. You couldn't get permissions to go and interview anyone. All the officials that you'd call would sort of say they were too busy, particularly after Tiananmen. I mean, it was incredible. I used to work for Reuters there. And as you know, Reuters is a news agency, so we depend on keeping that wire fed. You've got to keep the beast fed. But I remember on one particular day, the Reuters bureau, which included 5, I won't say well-paid, but anyway, paid correspondents sitting there. We had those chairs that you can sort of, on rollers, and we spent 5 whole days kind of playing bumper cars with our roller chairs because there was no news. We didn't write a word for 5 days. And our bosses were going nuts with us. Can you not find anything to write about? Soft feature, anything? There was really... So there are really difficult times in the 80s. But in really, I think, starting towards the end of the 90s, things loosened up a lot, particularly under the Zhurongji, Jiang Zemin era, especially under the Zhurongji tutelage. I mean, I felt that was a breath of... shall we say, objectivity within China. Premier Zhu would often criticize the statistical reporting of local officials and et cetera himself. So it was open season for journalists such as myself to go down into localities and try and find out the things that Premier Zhu himself was criticizing. And we found also that in localities in China, all of which are competing against the next locality, and one of the things they're competing for is foreign direct investment. And so when they get a newspaper out like ours going to arrive there, they began to see us not so much as a threat, but an opportunity. And so they would welcome us in many places. And that's really how I spent the last 8 years, going from one locality to another locality to another one, and trying to construe the picture from the grassroots level about what was happening in Beijing. And then, of course, you go and attend some of the press conferences in Beijing, and you have a much better sense of where the government is telling the truth and where they may not be telling the truth. So I think those are the good things. It's got a lot better. It's got a lot easier for foreign journalists to operate, but there still are difficulties, obviously. And this latest trend that you mentioned with the Singapore Times reporter Ching Chong and with the New York Times assistant being arrested and sentenced is obviously something that us journalists regard as a negative trend. And I would say that the antecedents of that trend must be that the government in Beijing is more nationalistic than it has been in the past and is more jealous of its reputation internationally. And I don't fully understand the reasons for that. I think that, China was getting pretty good press for the last sort of 8 years. I mean, it was a huge improvement from the type of press that China was getting in the early 90s after Tiananmen. So I don't really see why the government would want to punish the journalistic community at this stage. But maybe I'm missing something.
And actually, I need to be very strict here and say that because James is going to run off and do an interview with Diane Rehm show this morning. So I'm going to just kind of close out here by I'm going to ask you all to applaud wildly in a moment, to thank him for his wonderful talk. But also, the bookseller is there outside, and you must get it, because I think he didn't talk even, so much of the book that I loved was that so much of talking to people at the local level. And also, again, wandering around Italy, and I was like, I wonder what kind of budget you had for doing this book. This seemed like a lot of fun to do, too.
I was paid by myself.
Yeah, okay. Well, go buy his book. But can we applaud wildly and thank him for this wonderful book? Thank you very much. So, yeah, I hope that, would you like to talk about the environment?
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, I had to learn about the environment last night on a database.
I didn't want that to go right. I just said in your talk, just make sure.
I mean, you don't get wonderful outcomes. Questions. I mean, this is the thing about being in the States, really.
But the nice thing, though, but the environment angle is one that you can see.
Oh, totally. And I think there was